First story.
In the summer of 2006, the Johnson family, Sarah, her husband Greg, and their two children, 9-year-old Katie and 6-year-old Will, decided to take a camping trip to Yellowstone National Park. It was a trip they had been planning for months, a chance to bond, roast marshmallows, and enjoy the majesty of nature. Little did they know, the forest would hold something far more sinister than the beauty they sought. They set up camp in a remote area away from the busier campgrounds, wanting to avoid crowds. The site was picturesque, with a dense canopy of pine trees and a gentle river flowing nearby. Everything seemed perfect. The first night went smoothly. Stories around the fire, laughter, and s'mores. By 10 p.m. they retired to their tents, the peaceful sound of the forest lulling them to sleep. But at around 3 a.m., Sarah woke up to a noise just outside the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around their camp. At first she thought it was a bear, but the steps were too measured, too human. She nudged Greg awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" Greg strained his ears and his eyes widened. "Who would be out here at this hour?" he whispered back. They stayed quiet, barely breathing, listening as the steps circled their tent, once, twice, then stopped. A long silence stretched out. Then they heard it, something breathing, just inches from the thin fabric of the tent. A low, rattling inhale followed by a shuddering exhale. Sarah clutched Greg's hand, paralyzed with fear. The breathing lingered for what felt like hours before the steps started again, slowly fading into the woods. In the morning, they found nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no signs of animals. Greg brushed it off as paranoia. Probably just a raccoon or something, he insisted. Sarah wasn't convinced, but she didn't want to ruin the trip. That day, they hiked and swam in the river, trying to forget the eerie incident. The kids laughed and played, unaware of their parents' unease. By nightfall, everything felt normal again. But the second night was different. Around midnight, Will woke up crying. "There was a man in the woods," he said, trembling. "He was smiling at me." Sarah's blood ran cold. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart," she whispered, trying to calm him down. But then Katie, pale and wide-eyed, whispered, "I saw him too." Greg went out with a flashlight, scanning the trees. The beam revealed nothing but shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. He told himself it was just the children's imaginations, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They decided to cut the trip short and leave first thing in the morning, but that night the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by a low, distorted voice. It was impossible to tell what it was saying, a garbled string of words like someone speaking underwater. Sarah clutched her children tightly, whispering prayers. Greg gripped a hunting knife, his knuckles white. The steps grew louder, circling the tent again and again. Then they stopped abruptly, and the forest went dead silent. As dawn broke, they packed up in a frenzy and drove away without looking back. When they got home, Greg checked the news out of curiosity. What he found left him cold. A hiker had gone missing in that same area a week earlier. Authorities later found the man's body, but his death was a mystery. No animal attack, no signs of injury. Just a look of terror frozen on his face, as though he had seen something unimaginable in his final moments. The Johnson family never went camping again, and sometimes, late at night, Sarah swears she can still hear that slow, deliberate crunch, crunch, crunch just outside her window.
Second story.
The trail was called Raven's Ridge, known for its stunning mountain views and challenging terrain. Avery and her boyfriend Mark were avid hikers, always seeking new trails to conquer. They had heard about Raven's Ridge from an online forum, a remote, lesser-known hike tucked deep in the wilderness. It promised solitude, fresh air, and views untouched by civilization. But the warnings were easy to overlook. Stay on the trail, don't hike after dark, and if you hear an echo, never answer back. They laughed it off as just another creepy campfire tale. After all, what's a hike without a little folklore? They set off early in the morning, the sun filtering through towering pines. The trail was steep and winding, each turn offering breathtaking views of the valley below. As they climbed higher, the forest grew denser, the air grew colder, shadows lingered longer between the trees. By late afternoon they were miles deep into the forest, the trail narrowing as it hugged the edge of a cliffside. The silence was absolute. Not a bird, not an insect, only the sound of their footsteps crunching on gravel and their breath misting in the air. "Mark, we should head back soon. It's getting late, Avery. Look, it's another trail. It's not on the map. Mark, maybe there's a reason for that, Avery. Oh, come on, just a little further. We might get an even better view." Mark hesitated, but her enthusiasm won him over. They stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path, pushing through tangled branches and dry brambles. As they walked, the forest seemed to close in. The air grew colder still. The path wound deeper into the woods, and the sunlight faded faster than it should have. Then they heard it, a soft, faint sound, an echo of footsteps behind them. "Mark, did you hear that? Avery, maybe there's someone else on the trail." They turned and looked back. Nothing. The path was empty, stretching into shadow. They pressed on, but the footsteps followed, mirroring their pace. When they stopped, the sound stopped. When they moved, it resumed. Then Avery heard a whisper. Her name. "Avery, did you just say my name?" "Mark, no. We need to go back. Now." They turned to retrace their steps, but the path behind them was gone. The trail was swallowed by dense forest, as if it had never been there. Panic tightened Avery's chest. "Avery, where's the trail?" A chilling wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, mocking laughter. Then they heard the footsteps again, faster, closer, no longer an echo. Something was following them. They ran. Branches clawed at their faces. Roots snagged their feet. The forest seemed to twist around them, the trees shifting like sentinels, blocking every path. The sound of footsteps grew louder, relentless, pounding like a drumbeat in their ears. And then ahead, Avery saw it. A break in the trees, the faint outline of the main trail. Safety. "Avery, we're almost there." They burst through the foliage, stumbling onto the gravel path. The forest fell silent. They turned back, hearts pounding. The narrow path they had followed was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. "Mark, look." In the shadows just beyond the tree line, two figures stood watching them. Pale, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that looked decades old. Their lips moved silently, and their faces twisted into sinister smiles. Then, in perfect unison, they whispered, "Figures, go back." Mark and Avery didn't wait to find out what they meant. They sprinted down the trail, not stopping until they reached the safety of their car. They never hiked Raven's Ridge again. And to this day, if you step off the trail, some say you can still hear faint footsteps behind you, chasing you deeper into the woods. And if you're foolish enough to answer the whisper of an echo, you might never find your way back.
Final story.
When Jenna, Lucas, and Eric planned their camping trip, they envisioned a weekend of adventure. Hiking by day, campfires, and ghost stories by night. They picked a remote site deep in the forest, a place called Hollow Creek Campground, a name that should have been a warning. The drive took longer than expected, and by the time they arrived, dusk was bleeding into night. The forest felt oppressively quiet. The chirp of crickets and rustle of wind that usually brought comfort in the woods was strangely absent. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on dry leaves as they set up camp. "Lucas. Spooky already," Lucas joked, but his laughter sounded flat, absorbed by the dark trees. They set up their tents, built a fire, and roasted marshmallows. It felt normal enough until Eric noticed something off. "Eric, hey, do you guys hear that?" "Jenna, hear what?" "Eric, nothing, no birds, no bugs, just nothing." A shiver ran down Jenna's spine, but she shook it off. "Jenna, maybe they're all sleeping?" As the fire crackled and cast flickering shadows, they decided to tell scary stories. Jenna went first, spinning a tale of an escaped convict lurking in the woods. They laughed nervously, the tension easing. Lucas was about to start his story when the silence broke with a faint rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the trees just beyond the fire's light. They froze, eyes scanning the darkness. "Lucas." "Probably a woodpecker," Lucas whispered, though his voice trembled. "Eric!" Woodpeckers don't tap at night. Their fire, once warm and inviting, now felt like a fragile barrier between them and something unseen. Lucas stood up, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. The beam landed on a tree, and for a moment they saw nothing. Jenna gasps. Near the base of the tree, just inside the edge of the light, was a figure, small, unmoving. Its pale face turned toward them, a child. She looked no older than 7. Her dress was old-fashioned, stained with mud. Her hair hung in lank, dirty strands over her face. She stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her. "Lucas! Hey, are you okay?" Lucas called out, his voice shaking. The girl tilted her head slightly. Her lips curled into a small, unnerving smile. Before they could react, she stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. "Eric, did she seem wrong to you?" Jenna nodded, unable to speak, her heart hammered in her chest. Then from behind them a voice whispered, "Girl, are you lost too?" They spun around, the firelight barely reaching into the woods. The girl was there again, standing closer now, her eyes wide and empty. Eric grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at her. The beam flickered, then died. "Lucas, run!" They bolted into the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, the cold air clawing at their lungs. Behind them, they heard the girl's voice, sweet and lilting, carried by the wind. "Girl, don't leave me, stay forever!" Her voice warped into a guttural snarl. Something heavy crashed through the underbrush behind them. They didn't look back. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. Gasping for breath, Lucas fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently. The engine roared to life and they sped away, gravel spraying behind them. No one spoke. No one dared to look in the rearview mirror. When they finally reached town, they reported what happened. The ranger listened, his face grim. "Ranger, Hollow Creek, we don't recommend that place. There's no official campsite out there." "Lucas!" "But it was marked on our map." "Ranger, no, the real campground was shut down years ago after a little girl went missing. Some say she still wanders those woods looking for someone to play with, or to keep her company." He paused, his eyes darkening. "Ranger, but if you see her, you better run, because she's not alone."
Whether you're pitching a tent under the stars or trekking through the wild, remember this. Nature may seem peaceful, but it's always watching, always waiting. Sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't told around the campfire, they follow you home. If you enjoyed these tales and want more nightmares to keep you company, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Here on Whispers of the Moon, we shine a light on the darkest corners of the world, where fear walks beside you. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, the wilderness doesn't always let you leave.